No, my hi to my welcome to the University of Waikato, Greg. I am Devon Plaszek and I'm the director of Te Puna Haumaru, the New Zealand Institute of Security and Crime Science. It's a real pleasure to have you here tonight, your morning. According to the information you were reluctant to give us, you are an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Geoinformatics and Meteorology, which is actually incredibly useful at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Greg's formal in education. He's got an MSc cum laude in Geographical Information Science from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands and a PhD in Geoinformatics at the University of Pretoria. And his research focuses mainly on the geospatial analysis of crime and criminal offenders more generally. But he's also got quite a strong research passion for drawing attention to Anglo-centric biases inherent in environmental criminology theory. He's now got over 100 research outputs in these areas and in related fields of crime seasonality, fear of crime gangs, and geodemographic offender profiling. Professor Breetzke has been quoted frequently in media in a number of countries, including South Africa and New Zealand, and he's been invited to present at numerous local and international academic conferences and symposia around the world, and he's won local and international awards for his research and has active research collaborations with colleagues in various countries. Finally, he's a member of ECA, which is the informal association of leading international scholars in the fields of environmental criminology, crime science, situational crime prevention, intelligence-led policing, and problem-oriented policing. I actually have written, I've published with Greg, and that is because Greg spent a period at the University of Canterbury. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to meet him there, but he quite wisely, I think, decided to leave to decamp New Zealand after the Christchurch earthquakes. And so it's sometime since I've seen you, Greg. So it's really lovely to be able to give you a warm welcome today to do this seminar for us.
Thank you, Devon, for that very kind introduction. Yeah, so this is, I guess this kind of work is a collation of much of what I've been doing over the last decade. I guess my PhD, which is 15 years ago now, looked at kind of Africanizing theory and how do we, I get with a lot of relevance to Indigenous New Zealanders, right? How do we kind of try and align Indigenous thought and Indigenous ideas into existing kind of Eurocentric theory? And so that kind of led to this, and the does anyone care portion. So the structure of the presentation is kind of divided into two. The does anyone care is another kind of side project I had, born out of days and weeks and months on end at home during the COVID lockdown, of looking to do a bit of a deep dive into the actual composition of editorial boards in criminology in general. And the results are pretty staggering in terms of the kind of biases that exist in terms of their composition, which has implications for kind of theory development, knowledge generation, with spillover effects into policy and practical implications for crime prevention and reduction. So the presentation is broken down into these two broad topics, and I hope to not bore you too much during the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So I thought I'd start the presentation with a bit of a quiz. So these are very colorful flags of the African continent. There's 55 countries in Africa. Well, it varies depending on whether Sudan is part of South Sudan or not. So it changes weekly, 55, 56, 55, 56. It's a very volatile area, as you know. The 2,100 represents the languages in Africa. So for context, Europe, for example, has 21 official languages and up to 200 different dialects in Europe. But there's over 2,100 distinct languages in Africa. Oftentimes, Africa from the outside is seen as a continent in which there's continual overthrow of government and clashes between factions within countries, and largely this is a consequence colonialism almost directly, simply because where you have 2,000 different languages and the number below that is 3,000, that's are distinct different ethnicities within Africa. To jump that into 50, to merge 3,000 ethnicities into 55 countries, you can see the differences and the problems that can arise, and which happens regularly. The 30.37, this refers to the size of Africa. which is remarkably big. This is the usual. I'm going to act like a geographer now, so this is your geography lesson for the next minute. The normal maps you see of the world minimizes the size of Africa because it's not an equal area projection. So as you go further away from the equator, the areas gets distorted. To actually see Africa as its true size, you need to see it in an equal area projection. This is an equal area projection of Africa, and you can see it comprises China, the United States, India, pretty much the whole of Europe in one. So from a geographical perspective, it's extremely huge. You can see the United Kingdom there for the British is just nestled within Madagascar on the lower right-hand side. That's known for the movie amongst above all else if you've got young children or not. So the homicide rate by country, this is important to identify with. And of course, this is a very coarse portrayal of homicide, but it does kind of provide some indication of why this topic is important. If you look at Africa, and again, this is, like I said in the previous slide, this relates to my topic on the size. So yeah, Africa is actually minimalized in terms of its actual size. But homicide is most often the highest in two regions of the world. And we use homicide here because it's the most valid form of crime to provide comparison, because there's a body most often, which is often hard to dispense with. And that is in Africa and Central Europe and Central Americas, where the homicide rate gets upwards of 30 per 100,000. In South Africa now, I think it's roughly in the mid-40s per 100,000, which is extremely high, as you can see on the map. A lot of the Africa and a lot of the Middle East, for example, is also hashed out, and that's because those homicide estimates are from the WHO. So they're not actually from official police resources. They're more from mortality data via EMS or emergency services or hospital data. So this speaks to an issue, particularly in Africa, but not just constrained to Africa, and that's the issue of data, which I'll touch on a little bit later. If we look at homicide by continent, you can see the global average is about 6.1 incidences of intentional homicide per 100,000. The Americas is 3 times that, or just almost 3 times that, which is somewhat distorted by the fact that they are grouped together. If you divided that or disaggregated it by Central, North, and South America, the Americas would be, Africa would be by far be the continent with the highest homicide rate, which is still in this indication roughly at 2/3 the global rate. So of course, when you talk about crime reduction and the need for prevention and strategies to reduce crime, and this is just homicide, it's important to kind of be aware that in the one continent, or at least one of the 2 continents, that this kind of information is needed the most, it's probably in Africa and in Central America, although not constrained to that alone. On the right-hand side, you see the 20 countries with the highest homicide rates in the world, and most of them are constrained to Central America, with some African countries mixed in. So the first part, as I mentioned, of the talk will be looking at kind of whether the theories and some of the theories and laws housed within environmental criminology, which is a type of criminology which kind of focuses on the importance of space in crime production and the measurement of risk, whether they apply, right? I'm going to be a little bit controversial a little bit later, which is always fun. And of course, these are not by any means all the theories and the laws and the axioms contained within environmental criminology. They're just some of them, right? They may be familiar to you. Certainly, if you're a postgrad criminologist, you would know at least the first one. So there are a number that I have neglected, but of course, due to time constraints, I've just highlighted a few. The other kind of caveat I would say here is that these are a kind of a broad brushed, it's not a systematic review. It's not a meta review of the ability of these theories and laws to adequately explain African crime patterns. It's more of, I guess you could say, an anecdotal review. But having said that, a review of the literature was very much shorter than I anticipated, simply because of the fact that there is such a dearth of literature in this topic, which I think represents a massive opportunity also for New Zealand criminologists, which I'll touch on at the end. So if we go to the first one, and I will run through these relatively quickly because it's a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of text, but it's more the explanation that's important. So social disorganization theory, I'm not going to explain it. You should hopefully be familiar with it. It was developed in Chicago in the 1920s. Most of these theories developed in the United States, often within a specific city within the United States. I have an urban geography background, and I can tell you that even cities within New Zealand, rural towns within New Zealand, are different to each other. Often completely different to each other. So to try to kind of carry over 1920 Chicago to 2023 Cape Town or Kailicha or any township, it is a stretch in itself. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that it's a cut and paste. Of course, there's subtle nuances and variations that you need to take into account, but the theory still stands. So most of the central tenets in South Africa have been actually supportive of the social disorganization theory. But the big problem, and I think this has been noted by a number of criminologists, is how to operationalize the theory. The theory is born on the central tenets of family disruption, residential mobility, ethnic heterogeneity, and socioeconomic deprivation, and often trying to represent these concepts in contexts that are different to in which they were established is really tricky. Collective efficacy, which is part of the original social disorganization, is a good example of this. In the African languages, and the languages just in South Africa, we have 9 official languages. There aren't words to describe collective efficacy in Zulu, or Tswana, or Xhosa, or Chonga, or Pedi, or Ndebele. There are no words to describe that. And that's very difficult. If you can't describe a concept, how do you operationalize it in a model or try to test it, right? So this is, and then you constrain to census variables, which are often also extremely limited in perception and range and the ability to measure. So Guy Lamb from Stellenbosch University in a paper had a good quote, and he said, oftentimes in South Africa, you get perverse forms of social cohesion. So we think of social cohesion often or almost exclusively in a positive way, right? If a neighborhood is socially cohesive, it has the ability to restrict behavior or deviant behavior in the neighborhood. He identified, at least in South Africa, that you can get perverse form of social cohesion form out of common grievances about community well-being. In other words, if you have a neighborhood and you have a common grievance about something, it can also lead to community social cohesion, but that often has a negative effect rather than a positive effect in reducing crime risk. It actually can increase crime risk because communities gather together or knit together about a common grievance, whatever that can be, and that can increase crime risk. And I'll touch on this a little bit later. Another interesting study, and you'll see a lot of these studies are very recent, at least in the last 5 years, which also shows that this is pretty much a burgeoning research area. In Ghana, there was only one study I could find. Again, some positive relationships found, but they also found, again, this idea of social cohesion. People perceived neighborhoods as being more dangerous the closer knit they were. Again, this is counterintuitive to a Western idea of social cohesion. They found in Ghana, and this is also very prevalent in South Africa, that oftentimes a very community, and you may get this in certain parts of Auckland and in New Zealand, where you get communities that are very close-knit. They're perceived as being more dangerous because if there is someone that is wanted for a crime, they could be protected by that neighborhood, right? So it wasn't that crime necessarily was higher in that neighborhood, measurably higher, but the perception was that crime was higher because I know that this person, it's the whole brother's keeper culture, which is very prevalent in Africa. It's my neighbor or my uncle or my cousin or my nephew or my brother is more important than there's a lack of accountability. Keeping them safe in our house or keeping them covered in our neighborhood is more important than the police wanting them for questioning of a particular type of crime, which I found very interesting. In Nigeria, Omar and colleagues also found limited support for social disorganization. similar things where they found measures were inappropriate or difficult to measure. So 84% of South Africa's economy is informal, as opposed to about 20% in Europe, which means that income measures are not a good description of income, because generally income measures are based on the formal economy and not the informal economy. So when he introduced income measures in his models, they completely threw out a whole lot of kind of wacky findings, and he boiled it down to the fact that it was the informal economy that was not captured by the income variables. And of course, by throwing income variables in, you constrain to those that are paying tax and that are adequately recording the income. In Rwanda, this is the last slide on this. Again, Brem, this is a study published in Criminology, looked at the impact of what predicted genocidal violence in the Rwandan genocide of 1994. And again, they found some support for some measures, but again, they found that some structural characteristics that influence crime prevention actually positively motivated crime, depending on the goal of the community. So if the goal of the community, in a very kind of perverse sense, was to kill Tutsis, the Hutus killed roughly 800,000 Tutsis in the space of 3 months, that led to an increase in genocidal violence. None of the other structural indicators of social disorganization were significant, except the idea that this community was very, had a lot of social cohesion, and their common goal, and often we, in the social disorganization literature, the idea of a common goal is a common good. If we have a common goal, it's a common good goal to get deviants off the street or report suspicious behavior. Here it twisted around, and here the common goal was to rid this neighborhood of Tutsis if we can gather around this common goal. So it's a really interesting study and kind of different take on the social disorganization. And lastly, and this is a report in Mozambique, which is next to us, they found broad support, but increased crime in more affluent areas around police stations, which is contrary to what the theory would suggest. Then on to the second, this is not a theory, but this is kind of these concepts that are housed within crime pattern theory, and that's the idea of crime generators and attractors. So crime generators generate crime just by the sense that people gather there, such as the shopping mall. They don't attract crime necessarily, but they generate crime simply because you get more foot traffic and more people along. Crime attractors, on the other hand, generally tend to attract crime because you get kind of people looking at more nefarious types of activities in crime attractors, such as, I guess you could say, alcohol outlets and casinos would be others. So in Nigeria, there's transport nodes, tourist sites and neighborhoods. Again, recent studies that have identified these. In South Africa, work by myself and some other colleagues have identified similar kind of generators and attractors, as you can see there. I'd like to draw your attention to the last one. And this is, again, a particularly African example. And this is where this kind of, you need to change your way of thinking a little bit when you try and align, again, these kind of Anglo-centric concepts. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, how on earth does a toilet generate crime? If I'm sitting at home, why I have too many glasses of orange juice and I need to go to the loo at 1 a.m, how is that going to increase my crime risk? Well, this is work done by Greg Gonzalez at the Yale School of Public Health, together with some South African colleagues at the University of Cape Town. And this is because you assume that your toilet is in the house, right? So this is the work that's been done in Khayelitsha. This is an area, you can see Table Mountain in the background. So this is about, those of you that have been to Cape Town, if you remember ever landing in Cape Town, as you come out of the airport, Khayelitsha stretches for about 10 kilometers as you're driving towards Cape Town. It's an area, the population is massive. It's about the size of Cincinnati in the US or Liverpool in the UK, for context, bigger than Christchurch in terms of population, in an area probably the size of, South Auckland or something. So it's extreme high density, extreme poverty. Most of the toilets, a lot of the toilets are outside the dwelling type. These researchers mapped about 5,600 odd toilets, and linked over 600 sexual assaults per year, linked to walking to the toilet. Now you can imagine in winter, walking to toilets, that journey and back, especially as a female, this is a prime target. So they identified these as crime generators and attractors in the community, and identified also safe routes that people can take to be safe, and the intervention of lights and other types of crime prevention mechanisms. The law of crime concentration. This is David Weisberg, who quotes a Sutherland address over 60 years ago, roughly 60 years ago, saying, and this is again, this irritates me when I hear quotes like this, because in the Sutherland address, it says the law of crime concentration is a general proposition of universal validity, even though at the time no law of crime concentration had ever been undertaken, pretty much outside of the United States. And this kind of language, and it does get to me a little bit. So again, a recent study by Haumaru in Nigeria actually looked, and this was the first study ever done, almost 70 years after the quote, looking at in an African context. And they did find concentration of crime in Nigeria. This was done using survey data. So at the household level, 8% of crime, 50% of crime were in 8% of households. 50% of crime were in 11% of street segments, and 50% of crime was done in neighborhood street segments. I've done some work in this space with a colleague, Ian Edelstein. We looked at that in Tshwane, in where I live, and we found a similar kind of, the SAL stands for neighborhood, or it would be like a enumeration area in New Zealand. Again, 50% of rape, robberies, and assaults occur in low percentages of neighborhoods. And then a graduate student of mine, Kayla Tron, has got a paper in press looking at it at the street segment level. On the right-hand side, you can see that's the formal side of Khayelitsha, which you saw earlier in the photo. 40% of Khayelitsha is informal. So what you saw on the photo was the informal area of Khayelitsha. That's the formal, which has some road segments. And then a colleague, Andrew Lemur and Corne Elof, looked at again in a different kind of way of thinking, seeing that 90% of rhino poaching in the Kruger National Park occurred within 2.5 kilometers of a road. So in terms of law of crime concentration, again, largely accurate, but again, in two studies, both done in the last 2 years, with much more needing to be done. In terms of the last one, in terms of crime drop, this is also very interesting, and I had a long discussion with the kind of originator of the crime drop, Graham Farrell, a few weeks ago about this. There's usually a sprinkling of Africa. So there's often, it's Cicilline and colleagues say global studies of the crime drop. In her study, there were 26 countries, but 2 from Africa. That doesn't really constitute a global study in my mind, but they do sign up. She did find that this crime drop, this notion that crime has decreased across most of the developed world, at least over the last 30 years or so, due to largely increase in situational crime prevention, and showed. Now here you see the differences in terms of these studies. So here you have two countries from Africa. I think it was South Africa and maybe Nigeria or something. Now they showed steeper decline in burglary in African contexts. A study later on looked at 100 countries, again, a global study, mind you, with 5 countries in Africa. And they said crime rates in Africa, again, declined from 95 to 2010. Here you get probably the most comprehensive study done 2 years ago. They looked at 166 countries and where the crime had dropped across 166 countries. Here they include 35, so more than half of the African countries. And what did they find? A substantial increase in crime. So suddenly when the number of countries in Africa increases from 2 and 5 to 35, you see major increases in countries. In 27 of the 35 African countries included in their study, in total contradiction to the crime drop. There was a study in New Zealand done on the crime drop, but it was done over 20 years ago by Mayhew. So this is for me, if I was there, it was a wonderful master's topic to look at crime drop in New Zealand over the last 20 years and to see whether this is the case. But not only that, a lot of the crime drop literature now is looking at deep diving in the crime drop. So you can look at crime drop in New Zealand globally, right, over 20 years, but you can also see if there's been increases at the neighborhood level. Maybe crime has dropped in New Zealand, but there could be neighborhoods, for example, that have increased over 20 years. And what's the difference between the neighborhoods that have increased compared to the neighborhoods that have decreased? So this is the kind of nuances of crime drop that's beginning to take place in the literature now. It's not just looking at overall crime trends from 2020 from 2000 to 2020, but rather to say, what are the subtle variations that exist, and does it differ by crime type, and so forth. The only study that's been done looking at this at a national level was done in Ghana, published 2 years ago. Again, he found decreases over those time periods, but again, 136% increase in theft. Now, the irony of crime drop theory is that most of the crime is supposedly dropped through property crime and not through violent crime. So most of the drops, because property crime is most susceptible to situational crime prevention mechanisms. And here you find something completely contrary to that. I've got a postgraduate student that's looking at some of this literature now. Now, this is where I begin to stand on my soapbox a little bit, because the problem with doing African-based spatial crime research, and this applies to large parts of the world, not just Africa, is the research of reality. To get data is very difficult. It's also difficult in New Zealand. Accuracy is obviously always an issue with spatial crime data. You get underreporting. To give an example, and I would say it's similar to New Zealand, but not to the same extent. In Khayelitsha, we obtained official alcohol license data from the Western Cape Liquor Licensing Authority, which gave us, I think, about 50 official licensed outlets. Work done by Richard Matsopoulos at the University of Cape Town and colleagues mapped the location of 800 illegal alcohol outlets. So you have this kind of economy that's running under the ground, right? And you can't map this, you can't use it in analysis, which makes it very difficult. If you got an area like this, and this is a kind of snapshot of Khayelitsha, and Khayelitsha is not a standout in South Africa. There's probably close to 120 townships throughout the country that look very similar. How do you police in this area, right? If it's raining, police do not go there. There's opportunities to be ambushed very easily and very quickly by people who know the area. So they often go on horseback, for example, but no police officer will go anywhere near that, and particularly not in the night. So doing spatial-based research in Africa is extremely challenging. The publishing reality is something I've been confronted with, and you may, I know there's one or two young people listening. I don't want to scare you off. But publishing reality is that most of the time, if you submit a paper for review, particularly to a top journal, it has to be within a theoretical framework, right? Which is, editors or editorial or reviewers often insist on that. And they often are embedded within a Western Anglo-centric idea. I submitted papers when I initially started out saying, well, this is a data-driven idea. I don't want to be constrained to a particular type of theory, and I couldn't get it out for even peer review. So then you kind of fall back to social disorganization, routine activities of crime pattern, and then you go take it from there. And support is often, in inverted commas, encouraged for these theories. If I'm a little bit older in the game now, so I can push back a little bit, particularly when discussing results about how this, is in contrast or in conflict with a lot of theory. But certainly when you want to get your publication record out, you kind of err on the side of supporting a theory, even when probably it doesn't. So here's the counter narrative, and these are things that I'd like for people to think about, just to kind of open your mind out. I'm not even going to mention these things because I'll just embarrass myself, and I'm aware that this is being recorded. But do these crime controls in China reduce crime in London? Do neighborhoods with greater Ubuntu have lower crime levels? Does the presence of New Makumi, I've got a PhD student based in Nairobi, reduce crime in Baltimore? And would that term better predict crime in Cincinnati than traditional neighborhood watch programs? Now, if you're thinking to yourself, but how do I represent Ubuntu? Like, what is Ubuntu? then, well, step into my office for the last 20 years, right? And these are terms that, kind of Anglo-centric bias, you don't even think about this, because it's like, why would we need to know this, right? Ubuntu is not collective efficacy. It's not social cohesion. It's not social control or informal social control. It's something completely different. But why can't we look at that in a Western context, right? And this is the counter narrative that I think needs to be more suitably addressed. So part two, and this is a bit of a shorter part, and kind of the segue to this is kind of the last slide, where I'm kind of questioning why these kind of questions aren't being asked in the criminological literature. And there may very well be, and I'm sure there are, Pacifica and Maori concepts that you could easily substitute in there. And I think this is something that is really interesting to look at. And these talk to the broader structural inequalities that exist in higher education. We know this, and the area is a very interesting area. If you actually look into there's a journal called Psychometrics, which does a lot of this kind of analysis. Staff composition, predominantly skewed towards white, male. This is in the United States at least. Grant recipients, which I found very interesting, and publication bias, citation bias. And the one we're going to be looking at is, as it's mentioned, editorial boards, which in criminology are predominantly white, male, and from the global north. The last study by Ferolda, Cabana, and Lamella, published 2 years ago, looked at it particularly from a criminological perspective, but they only had a sample of about 10 journals. And they mentioned a number of reasons for why the editorial boards. Of course, there's a lot of historical reasons that are mentioned, but there's also kind of more nefarious reasons mentioned, such as the lack of skills and competencies is a common one, lack of English proficiency, although with AI, I don't think that would be a problem in the near future. Ignorance and actually misogyny has also been mentioned, which led to a kind of side project I did, as I mentioned at the beginning, during COVID, locked in a study trying to dodge my kids and make an excuse for not being able to be disturbed, which I looked at all the journals within criminology, penology indexed in the Web of Science. There's actually 70 journals. One was excluded because they didn't have any information, despite reaching out to them. So it's around 2,600 editorial board members. And the data was collected, as I mentioned, in the first half of 2021. And this is a breakdown of editorial board membership. So if you add North America and the British Isles, which includes Ireland, Northern Ireland, right, at least, it adds up to almost 80% of editorial board members from these two regions. If you take the last 5 regions, Middle East, Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia, it's less than 5% collectively. Even though they are 80% of the world's population contained. And as I mentioned in the second or third slide, particularly Central America and Africa and South America, homicide rates are notoriously high. And I know of colleagues that are doing a lot of very good work in South America to a lot of success, but the actual kind of foundational knowledge of crime causation is still very raw and unknown in these areas. If we go to a country breakdown, if you just look at the United States, it's about 56%. If you add the United Kingdom to these two countries, again, you get to just over 75% represented. And New Zealand does have a presence, as you can see over there. I think it's about 5 or 6, I'm not sure, representation. The news gets worse if you do a little bit more of a deep dive. Forget all these numbers. I don't, as Devin will attest, I'm not big into big complex models, because then often you kind of lose the detail. I like very simple things, but that send a strong message here. And this is a very simple analysis of a journal quality. Now, I'm not a big fan of the impact factor, but it's a kind of something that we have to deal with. And so these Q1 to Q4, the high indicates the high quality journals. So those are journals in the top quartile. So in criminology, it would be Criminology, Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, a few others, and then the low quality. And as you can see there, and I've highlighted these, the one in green, it's just a sliding scale of the number of editorial board members by journal quintile. And you can see that the editorial board members that are from North America are much more likely to be in better journals. Those editorial board members from Africa that are editorial board members in the Web of Science are much more likely to be in poorer quality journals. So even the small representation in Africa, and you can see if you look at the other regions, even the small representation that you do get from these regions, they're on much lower quality journals in inverted commas. But of course, there's a argument to be had about this. Now, there is a counter argument, and I'm sure you're thinking of a few as I'm going through this. Ken Pease mentions that there's 470 higher educations in the United States offering first degrees of criminology. So, of course, it makes sense that they're overrepresented. And not only the country, but the region in terms of the editorial board composition. And that argument I agree with completely. But for me, my argument is that the centric has just gone too far. For example, India has 3 editorial board members out of 2,627. Brazil has 3 out of 2,627. If you look at China, it has 19 out of 2,627, and 10 are in one journal, which is the Asian Journal of Criminology. So if you take that journal out, they have 9 out of 2,627. Now, there are some duplicates. Obviously, a lot of people here would be editorial board members of more than one journal, but the duplicates is not that much. It's much less than I thought, just because the journals often vary quite considerably in their discipline. I think it represents about 4%. So it's not that different. So you could say, well, it depends not just on the offerings, but also on papers, right? If the US publishes more, they should have more representation. Well, China publishes the highest number of papers per year on average, almost over 100,000 papers more than the United States, which comes second. This is a study done by Wagner. And this is across disciplines, right? Then you could say, well, it's not just the quality, it's the quantity. It's how many papers are being cited. Well, China has the top 1% most highly cited publications, ahead of the United States 4 years ago, and almost 10 years ago ahead of the European Union in 2015. So papers published with the Chinese affiliation are also the most highly cited of the last 4 years. They do not, this particular paper by Wagner does go to subdisciplines. Criminology is not mentioned as a particular discipline, but it's grouped within the social sciences as they bracketed. And even within the social sciences, the United States publishes less and is less cited. So it's not just an argument of saying they're publishing more and they're more read and cited. It's an argument that I think was a little bit short. And why should we care? So diversity breeds more innovative science. This is a really, really one of the best papers I've read in a long time by Hofstede, published in Science. It's very short. And he looked at about 1,400 PhD graduates from the United States, or something in that area, and where they went to and what kind of academic environments they went to. And they found in their analysis how diversity breeds more innovative science. I mentioned at the beginning the importance of diversity for theory development and knowledge generation, but editorial boards across disciplines in these studies found that greater diversity has a greater range of theoretical, publishes more different theory and different methods. And for me, it provides a measure of academic credibility and generalizability as a kind of common thread throughout this talk. So the flag I showed at the beginning was, I'll show it again, but here I've blanked out the studies that I've shown with some results known about spatial crime patterns. The rest we know nothing about. Right. And I would say that it's probably pretty similar in Oceania, right? Maybe outside of Australia and New Zealand, there's very little that's known about this. Now, I mentioned the problems with data, and these are problems, but the point of particularly PhD research is often to try and think of novel and new ways to get around the challenges and hurdles that you're confronted with. So I think this represents an opportunity. We know nothing about a lot of these studies at these countries rather, and I think it's an opportunity growth area in criminology to explore this. Two quotes which I think kind of adequately sum up why we should care. This is the study by Garner and the crime drop. Making theoretical assumptions mainstream Western exploratory paradigms tend to diminish the social, political, and cultural context of crime and punishment in Africa. And I think you can translate that, at least carry that over to other contexts as well. Criminologists have either ignored the problem completely in a most theoretically primitive fashion, and colonialism is remarkably silent by crime causation. This is something that was mentioned over 25 years ago, and I don't think much has changed since then. There is certainly more sympathy to kind of the issues of EDI, equity, diversion, inclusion in criminology, but I think a lot more has to be done before there is change. So I thought I'd also end off with some implication for Maori. We know Maori are overrepresented in all stages of the criminal justice system in New Zealand. The criminology tradition has been largely influenced by theoretical developments in the United States and Europe. I think that's a fair comment. A PhD by Webb 20 years ago articulates in great detail how the philosophy of crime and justice differs considerably from these frameworks. And so these idea of indigenous spatial theories of crime, or the way in which you can try and pull in indigenous concepts in terms of understanding crime causation and crime risk, is very important. And I think it's a growth area in this space, especially with society in general being more sympathetic and more, I guess, cognizant of the importance of inclusion and diversity and equity. So it's a call for collaboration. If this interests you in any way, you're more than welcome to contact me and discuss. Thank you very much. My time is on just gone on 44 minutes. I don't know if I started a bit late, but and I hope I haven't been on mute the whole time. But yes, thank you very much, and I welcome any questions that you may have.